Good afternoon. I'm going to invite everybody to take their seats. It's good to start on time because we have such a short amount of time. So I'd like to welcome you all here. Excellencies, distinguished delegates to the 25th Crime Commission, and colleagues and friends who are joining us also from other countries as we stream this cute little camera here and one in the back. This event live via webcast. My name is Karen Judd Smith, and I welcome you here to this very important discussion on diffusing religious extremism and building the capacity of conservative religious communities as key partners in counterterrorism efforts. Those of you here in Vienna know well the full scope of issues the Crime Commission endeavors to address within its 1 week of deliberations. So it's not surprising that we have such a short time on this topic, even though it warrants far more than the precious moments we can give it now. Now, I'm convinced that it's not only logical to solicit the contribution of religions to the work of diffusing religious extremism, as well as other forms of radical exclusion. Furthermore, that we would be unwise not to optimize such a potent resource as religion done well, and put it to good use in each of our communities, East, West, North, and South. Before I provide a bit more context for this session, I do have to let you know that, as I said to the ambassador before, I'm going to be a little bit unreasonable. What moderator is unreasonable, ever? But I'm going to ask each one of our extremely worthy and capable speakers to keep their remarks to what I'm calling a 10-minute teaser talk. I want to make sure that they give you just enough of a taste of what they've done and are doing, that you'll be left hungry for more and will pursue them at the end of the session before they can escape the doors of this room. I'm also going to be the mean moderator because we do want to have time at the end of our short 50 minutes to get some feedback from you, as well as answer some of your questions that you may have. So now you're going to hear from 3 speakers representing different aspects of society, a member state, the United Nations, staffer, and civil society. I see this too as a sort of model of sorts of how when diverse actors work together, our experience and understanding can be significantly enhanced and new possibilities open up that are otherwise just not possible. By the time you leave here, I believe you will begin to better understand the Marrakech Declaration as a strategic, bold, and significant call for religious communities to match their words and deeds. And you'll hear from what Dr. Mohammed Slaoui from the Permanent Mission of the Kingdom of Morocco to the UN here in Vienna envisions for the growing impact of this declaration in the coming days and years. You will also hear about some of the on-the-ground accomplishments of the last 17 years of the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy's work from Dr. Douglas Johnson, who left a prestigious Washington think tank to form, as he calls ICRD, a do tank. He too was called to help turn words into deeds to improve lives. But first, I would like to invite Mr. Ulrich Garms of UNODC's Terrorism Prevention Branch to provide us a snapshot of the global framework within which we are all working and can work better together for preventing terrorism. This framework not only makes it possible for all of us to gather here today and this week to improve our collective responses to the drivers of violent extremism, it also, I believe, helps us identify best practices, bring them to scale, and help transfer them to the communities and countries that can benefit profoundly from their outcomes. So without further ado, I welcome Mr. Ulrich Garms of the UNODC's Terrorism Prevention Branch to take the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Dr. Slaoui, Dr. Johnston, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to thank the Permanent Mission of the Kingdom of Morocco and the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy for the invitation to UNODC to this very interesting and timely side event. As we are meeting here, there's a process going on at the level of the UN and primarily in New York, but also in all the capitals, which is called the Fifth Global Counterterrorism Strategy Review. The Counterterrorism Strategy is a document that was adopted by the General Assembly in 2006, in September of 2006, so that we are approaching 10 years of the global counterterrorism strategy. And every second year, the UN membership reviews and discusses whether there's a need to slightly adjust the actions to implement that strategy. And this year being the 10-year review, this is of course going to be a particularly important milestone in the implementation of the global counterterrorism strategy. The strategy is articulated into four pillars, and I apologize if I say something that many of you might be very well familiar with. It consists of four pillars. Each of the pillars lists measures that UN member states commit to take. The first pillar is measures to address the conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism. The second pillar is measures to prevent and combat terrorism. That is the measures that we maybe most often think of when we hear counterterrorism measures. That's military measures, intelligence cooperation, criminal justice, law enforcement, and financial measures to freeze assets and so forth. Then we have the third pillar, which is measures to build states' capacity to prevent and combat terrorism. And that third pillar includes an encouragement to UN member states to work with UNODC to strengthen their criminal justice response to terrorism. And the fourth pillar is measures to ensure respect for human rights in counterterrorism. I would like to very briefly speak here about Pillar 1, which is, I believe, very closely related to what the Marrakech Declaration and the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy try to achieve. What does Pillar 1 say? It identifies, among others, prolonged unresolved conflicts, dehumanization of the victims of terrorism, lack of the rule of law and violations of human rights, religious discrimination, national discrimination, and political exclusion, socio-economic marginalization, lack of good governance, youth unemployment, all these conditions as conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism. And of course, it stresses very much, as if it was in bold characters, that none of these conditions of conducive to terrorism can ever justify acts of terrorism. But measures to address the conditions conducive to terrorism are nonetheless essential if we want to tackle terrorism and its drivers effectively. And on the basis of that analysis, UN member states commit to work on conflict prevention, negotiation, mediation, peaceful resolution of prolonged conflicts, promoting a culture of peace, justice, human development, the global Millennium Development Goals, eradication of poverty, youth unemployment, and also to, as it says, continue to arrange under the auspices of the United Nations initiatives and programs to promote dialogue, tolerance, and understanding among civilizations, cultures, peoples, and religions, to promote mutual respect and prevent the defamation of religions, religious values, beliefs, and cultures. And there the global strategy refers also to the Alliance of Civilizations, which is an initiative that the former Secretary General Kofi Annan had actually launched 1 year before the global counterterrorism strategy was adopted. There's a feeling in many quarters that this pillar 1 of the global strategy has to some extent been neglected, and or not sufficient attention has been given to the measures outlined in Pillar 1 in the global action against terrorism, and that the security response, the criminal justice response, the financial action responses have received a great attention, but that these measures conducive, these, some would say, soft measures, have not received sufficient attention. And it is in part also to address that gap that on 24 December 2015, half a year ago, the Secretary General proposed to the UN membership his plan of action to prevent violent extremism. This plan of action, which is a public document, is currently being considered by the UN member states, and it will be discussed in the General Assembly as part of that fifth review of a global counterterrorism strategy that I've mentioned to you. There's a lot in that plan of action that would be very relevant to this meeting here. I will just read out one paragraph to you where the Secretary General notes that violent extremist groups cynically distort and exploit religious beliefs to legitimize their actions and recruit followers. Distortion and misuse of religion are utilized to divide nations, cultures, and people, undermining our humanity. Faith and community leaders are critical in mentoring vulnerable followers so as to enable them to reject violent ideologies and in providing opportunities for intra- and interfaith dialogue and discussion as a means of promoting tolerance, understanding, and reconciliation between communities. And on that basis, then, in his recommendations of the plan of action, the Secretary General recommends that member states engage religious leaders to provide a platform for intra- and interfaith dialogue and to promote tolerance and understanding between communities and voice their rejection of violent doctrines and emphasize the peaceful and humanitarian values inherent in their theologies. This is the UN-wide context, the global counterterrorism strategy context. In UNODC, we focus on the legal and criminal justice response to terrorism. And you might ask, well, that hasn't been among the things you have mentioned until now when you spoke about the global strategy. But I do think that there is a link between, very much a link between these measures under Pillar 1 and the dialogue and the action that you are trying to promote here, and the work that UNODC does. And I would like to highlight two aspects of that. The first is that the Security Council, the Council of Europe, and a number of other regional organizations require states to prohibit incitement to terrorism or public provocation to terrorism. And many states criminalize offenses such as incitement to terrorism, glorification, justification, encouragement to terrorism, apologie du terrorisme, and so forth. And these offenses have a great, well, they are essential for or at least some of them are essential for an effective preventive criminal justice response to terrorism. But as you will immediately see, they have also a great potential of interfering with freedom of expression and freedom of religion. And in this sense, the work that UNODC does with member states is to provide advice when member states approach us on their draft legislation, when they are reviewing their counterterrorism legislation. We try to assist them in striking the right balance between the criminalization of speech that can encourage persons to engage in terrorism and these fundamental freedoms of religion, expression, and association. And then we also provide training to judges, prosecutors, law enforcement officials on where international human rights courts, international human rights bodies, and national courts have found that very thin and sometimes difficult to identify line between what speech, even if we don't like it, has to remain permissible in a democratic society and what speech needs to be prohibited and criminalized. The second aspect, where UNODC provides technical assistance, capacity building, that I think is very relevant to this meeting here, is training on the use of what we call special investigation techniques. Special investigation techniques are investigative measures, covert investigation techniques, such as the infiltration of undercover agents, the use of informants, phone intercepts, placing listening devices, and obtaining call record data, and so forth. And these special investigation techniques are absolutely essential to a successful criminal justice response to terrorism, particularly if we do not only want to prosecute those who have committed an act of terrorism after the bombs have gone off, but if we actually want to catch them before a terrorist attack happens. At the same time, and this is something that is discussed in the media every day, these covert investigation techniques, just think of the term mass surveillance, have a great potential to interfere with human rights and the rule of law in democratic societies. Most of the debate in the media is about the impact that special investigation techniques have on the right to privacy. But in fact, they also have a great potential of impacting on freedom of expression and freedom of religion. If religious leaders or places of worship or religious schools are somehow suspected of being places where recruitment for violent extremism is done, then it is understandable that law enforcement agencies will deploy these surveillance techniques against these, will target with their surveillance techniques these religious places. And that, on the other hand, of course, has a significant potential of impacting on freedom of religion, of having a freezing effect on how people feel they can manifest and practice their religious beliefs. I will have concluded in a second, just to say that in UNODC, we provide a lot of training to countries around the world on how to strike that balance when they use special investigation techniques so as to achieve those legitimate objectives that these techniques are necessary for without disproportionately interfering with freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom of religion. The invitation to this very important event states that addressing the ideas behind the guns to counter terrorism is every bit as strategic as anything else taking place on or off the battlefield. As you will have seen, the UN Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy very much shares this approach. The question for us in UNODC Terrorism Prevention Branch is, to what extent is criminal justice also a tool that should be used to address those ideas behind the guns? And as I have tried to show, we certainly, there is a strong inclination now to use also criminal justice to address those ideas behind the guns, but this is something that has to be handled with great care. And we in UNODC try to provide technical assistance to UN member states in finding the right balance in that respect. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Finding the right balances are probably a little like walking on a knife's edge. I would like now to invite the representative from Morocco to take the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. With your nice smile, I think I can easily, you seem to be flexible, so I can speak more than 10 minutes.
We smile nicely, but
15 minutes is reasonable. So Dr. Johnston, Mr. Gams, I think Dr. Johnston, I met with you before without knowing you in Washington, D.C., in those think tanks of Washington, D.C., probably. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this side event, the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy, the UNODC, and also to my colleagues at the Permanent Mission who have scheduled this event, this side event. This side event is designed to explore some innovations to help combat all forms of radicalization leading to violent extremism. And today, I'm going to share with you a very old recipe to help combat radicalization. This recipe, of course, like we all know, not one country, one single country can combat alone this plague of terrorism. And but there are other avenues, and I'm going to propose this other avenue because in Moroccan counter-terrorism strategy, it includes both preventive measures and coercive measures. So the security alone and the security vigilance is not enough. So we have to also find out other avenues. And this is the object of this intervention today, is the preventive measure, and most particularly the religious measure. So this recipe is contained in a document dating back to the 7th century, but still more than ever valid and morally binding in the Islamic world without exception. It is actually part and parcel of our faith as Muslims. This is why I think it is very useful to have chosen to highlight and promote the Marrakech Declaration on the rights of religious minorities in predominantly Muslim countries. As a matter of fact, religious leaders and scholars from across the whole Islamic world convened in Marrakech in Morocco from 25th to 27th January 2016, a conference intending to endorse the responsibility of Muslims living in Muslim majority countries to protect religious minorities living in their midst. It is worth mentioning that President Barack Obama praised the Marrakech conference in his remarks related to this conference, and he said, I quote him, "We do know that there were Muslims from Albanians to Arabs who protected Jews from Nazis during the Second World War." I would like to add that during the golden age of Muslim civilization, actually 12 or 13 centuries, we never had, it was always an injunction in our faith to protect the people of the book, the minorities in our midst. And the result has been that during those 12 or 13 centuries, there have never been any pogroms or any this new phenomenon, terrorism. It's a new thing, a new plague, actually, that we have all to combat. And that's why we didn't observe, as I said, pogroms. On the contrary, Islamic areas, along with minorities, helped build a splendid civilization that benefited the whole world in all aspects, going from mathematics, science, to all other aspects, medicine. And so when we join hands with minorities, we reach very splendid results. And this has happened actually until the decadence of the Islamic world, the beginning of the colonizations in the 20th century. So the scholars participating in the conference in Marrakech were responding to a crisis. In recent years, several predominantly Muslim countries have witnessed brutal atrocities inflicted upon long-standing religious minorities. In the wake of the recent terrorist acts that have shaken several countries, the Muslim world is blamed for the acts of criminals that do not represent in any way our religion, Islam. So the resulting declaration, the Marrakech Declaration, Mr. Grimes has touched upon certain aspects of it, so I will try to be brief. It is a call for action for people to take individual and collective responsibility to reject discrimination and stereotyping. The vision of these high religious leaders who publicly stand for harmonious relations between people of various religions, traditions, was in itself a powerful signal to the rest of the world and to those who misinterpret religion for violence. As violence has no place whatsoever, no connection to religion. These values of coexistence, peace, respect for the other, and for unity within difference are the heart of our religion and every religion, by the way. So the misuse of religion for political reasons by terrorist groups such as Daesh has prompted this conference, which condemned violence in the name of religion and called for a courageous stance in addressing this issue in the education curricula. But there are other recommendations in this declaration that I'd like to allude very quickly to. The call upon Muslim scholars and intellectuals to develop a jurisprudence of the concept of citizenship, inclusive of diverse groups and taking into account global changes. The urge to politicians and decision makers to support all initiatives seeking to strengthen relations and understanding among various religious groups in the Muslim world. The establishment, or I would say the recall, of a broad movement for the just treatment of religious minorities in Muslim countries and the need to respect their rights. Finally, the call upon representatives of the various religions, sects also. I think about some extremist Buddhists in some areas, Asian countries, that we have to mention here. And these minorities confront all forms of religious bigotry, vilification, denigration of what people deem as sacred, as well as all discourses that promote hatred and bigotry. So in other words, the Declaration of Marrakech is a perfect illustration of the true message of Islam, which supports religious freedom. And at a time when Islam is co-opted and hijacked by terrorists in one hand, on the other hand, demonized by anti-Muslim groups, the international community needs to recall the unambiguous position, principles, and legacy of this religion and to hear the true voice of Islam. So I thank your think tank to gather scholars from different parts of the world and to treat this display. So, in other words, Marrakech Declaration is in essence a referral to the principles of the Charter of the Medina city in Saudi Arabia today, for the protection of non-Muslims living in Muslim majority countries, which inspired this recommendation. What is the Charter of Medina? It is an ancient document, like I said, dating back to the 7th century. It's one of the world's oldest written constitution, under the supervision of our beloved Prophet, Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, himself. It is a contract of coexistence and freedom of religion in a multi-religious state and rooted in the Islamic faith. So it is a belief that we are joyful or proud to share with you today. We have to show that certain events which are happening under the guise of Islam are driven and prompted by consideration which have nothing to do with religion, I insist, have nothing to do with our religion. In his address during the conference about Morocco's leading role in promoting interfaith dialogue and fostering religious tolerance, His Majesty King Mohammed VI as commander of the faith and defender of the faith, stressed, I quote, "I am committed to protect the rights of Muslims and non-Muslims alike. We in the Kingdom of Morocco see no reason for denying religious minorities any of their rights." In his statement, he referred to our guide, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, true teachings about religious minorities. I quote the Prophet, he recommended that Jews and Christians were to be treated, this is in the 7th century. He recommended that Jews and Christians were to be treated well, and that no monk, no rabbi, or a person found praying in a place of worship could be killed even in a time of war. He made transactions with the Jews, the Prophet ﷺ. He laid the foundations for treaties and for the protection of churches. He decreed that people believing in other faiths were not to be harassed. The many facets of Islam's peaceful coexistence with believers in other religions have had beneficial effect in all spheres, including business, trade, industry, and the exchange of ideas, as I mentioned earlier, in the golden age of Islamic civilization. Therefore, as far as Islam is concerned, peace and security are the norm for interaction between faiths. So thank you once again for this opportunity to share these essential teachings of Islam. Do I have only 1 minute?
You have 1 minute.
Thank you. I would like to just share a few words about my country, Morocco. This is an opportunity. So the Kingdom of Morocco is a distinct Muslim country, an old state nation dating back to the 12th centuries. And so with an old history of 12 centuries of respect for religious minorities, as described earlier. Morocco is known as an Islamic state, tolerant and moderate, that protects the rights of Christians, Jews, and where religious minorities can coexist in peace and harmony, a fact deeply rooted in our identity. By the way, in my young age, maybe 60% of my classmates were Jews. So I'm talking out of experience in Casablanca, because they were based in Casablanca mainly and other cities. So it's a fact deeply rooted in our identity, like I said. And by constitution, the king, commander of the faithful, is the guarantor of a peaceful and harmonious cohabitation of all components of our society. In that sense, and in order to fight against religious extremism and radicalization, particularly among young people, Morocco has initiated a large-scale set of reforms in the political, social, economic areas, as well as the religious segment. Since we are talking about the religious segment, I will just mention that we put in place since 2014 an institute devoted to the training of imams from Morocco and elsewhere in Africa, but also in Europe, as from friendly countries like France. And also Belgium is considering sending imams to Morocco. So they were created in order to emphasize and integrate the values of peaceful and tolerant Islam open to the world. This institute put Morocco ipso facto in a leadership position to fight extremism in the MENA region. And I'm ready to answer your questions if you have some. Thank you very much.
So you probably noticed I softened my stance a little. It was as I realized the wisdom of Dr. Slaoui in moving this event here into the press room. I believe there's nobody else moving in here right after, so we have a little wiggle room. Given that, I would like now to invite Dr. Douglas Johnson to the stage to give his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you to UNODC for making this possible, particularly you, Marilla. It's a pleasure privilege actually, to share a platform with Overt Garms and the leadership that his branch is showing in terrorist prevention, and Dr. Mohammed Slaoui in terms of the leadership that Morocco has been displaying, not only in facilitating the Marrakech Declaration, but also in training imams in the benefits of moderation, if you will, including a number from West Africa and some from European countries as well. Our center, the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy, bridges religious considerations and the practice of international politics in support of peacemaking. And what that means oftentimes is actually making religion part of the solution in some of these very difficult situations where people tend to automatically say that is the problem. You can flip that coin over and you can turn it to good advantage, which is what we've been trying to do since our inception some 17 years ago. We've been in about a dozen different places around the world, ranging from right now we're starting a process of providing conflict resolution training to religious leaders and other civil society leaders in Yemen. We facilitated a social contract between the Syriac Christians and the Kurds in Syria that will enable them to live in peace once the fighting subsides. Using Quranic admonitions and religious leaders, we were able to essentially rescue the 21 Korean missionaries that were held hostage by the Taliban in 2007. So everywhere we go, we find that it's unique and it requires a different approach. And two of these, education has been the strategic element. And I'd like to speak briefly about both of those. First is in Pakistan. Back in 2003, we had the opportunity to go into Pakistan and to facilitate reform of the Madrasas, the religious schools, including those that gave birth to the Taliban. It took me about a year of raising funds before we could actually kick off that project, but it started in 2004. Many people in the West are not mindful of the illustrious history of these religious schools. There is the image in the media of seedbeds of terrorism and a caveman-like mentality. That's by no means the whole truth. Back in the Middle Ages, they were without peer as institutions of higher learning in the world at the time. And it was only European exposure to them that led to our own university system in the West. And you would be amazed at how many of the traditions and mores of academe trace their roots back to the madrasas, wearing your mortarboards and tassels at graduation, funding a chair in a given discipline. All this traces back to the madrasas, and it should be no surprise. They were the model. We've just sort of forgotten about that. Unfortunately, under the influence of colonialism and British attempts to secularize these schools, the schools purged themselves of all disciplines that were either Western in nature or secular, out of a fear of losing their Muslim identity. So today, you find that the vast majority of these schools are about rote memorization of the Quran and the study of Islamic principles. Our goals there have been twofold. One is to expand the curriculums to include the physical and social sciences, but with a very strong emphasis on religious tolerance and human rights, particularly women's rights. Secondly is to transform the pedagogy to create critical thinking skills among the students. In these tradition-bound tribal cultures, you find there isn't a whole lot of room for creative thinking. But it's so important because you'll have a youngster who's graduated from the madrasa, has memorized the Quran from cover to cover, and he's done that in Arabic. His first language is Urdu. He really doesn't understand it at all. Along comes the local militant to recruit him for their cause, and they have no ability to question or challenge. And that's what we're trying to impart. Since we started this some 12 years ago, we have now engaged more than 5,000 madrasa leaders from about 2,500 madrasas in this process. The reasons that we seem to be enjoying success where no one else has, least of all the government of Pakistan, are threefold. First is ownership. We've done it in such a way that the madrasa leaders feel it's their reform effort, not something imposed from the outside, which means that they have a lot of ownership in the change process. Second, we inspire them with their own heritage, not only of the schools themselves, but going back to the early days of Islam, when many of the pioneering breakthroughs in the arts and sciences, including religious tolerance, took place under Islam, at a time, I might say, when Christianity was woefully intolerant. The more they hear this, we don't belabor it, but when we make reference to it, you find they walk a little taller and say, start thinking, hey, maybe we can do better too. And third, and I think probably most important of all, is grounding all suggested change in Islamic principles so that these madrasa leaders and faculty can feel they're becoming better Muslims in the process, and that their students will as well. At this point, I think that sounds like a large number, but it's not, because there's about 20,000 madrasas. But all the ones we've addressed have been in the more radical areas. So we have every confidence that this thing can take the whole country over time and make a real difference. Now, let me share with you just one anecdote to give you a feel for this whole idea about dealing with the ideas behind the guns. You may recall that some time ago, not too long ago, the Taliban had taken over a resort area up in the mountains of Pakistan called the Swat Valley. And we were conducting a workshop for 16 of the madrasas surrounding the valley. And toward the end of the workshop, a gentleman stands up. He's a madrasa leader. He also happens to be a commander in Lashkar-e-Taiba, which is the terrorist group that brought you Mumbai. And he stands up and he says, I came here for one reason and one reason only. It's to discredit everything you have to say. He says, but now I find myself standing here full of rage. Rage because for 26 years, I have been studying and teaching the Quran the way it was taught to me. He says, for the first time in my life, I sense the soul of the Holy Quran and its peaceful intent. I now see that the right way to advance Islam is through peace, not through conflict. I'm going to change what I teach my students, and I'm going to tell them why. Well, this is a very bold thing to say in mixed company in an arena, a context in which heads are rolling for a lot less than that. I suppose he was cut some slack because he was a terrorist commander. But, and this is one of the things that has just bowled me over in this whole process, is that once you penetrate the veneer of rage and hostility and engage these folks, not only do they get it, but many of them become champions of what you're talking about, at great personal risk to themselves. Well, we came back into this this arena of the Swat Valley a month later to see how it was going. And sure enough, he was doing exactly as he had said he would. Furthermore, we had with us a CNN team that had been several years trying to, document some of our work. And he said the same thing to CNN, for God and the entire world to hear. And so that's how, and then he says, enough. I think he felt like he was on thin ice. But that's just one of countless anecdotes. Systemically is how you actually make a difference. And toward this end, one of the things we did was to try to take steps to design a model curriculum for madrasas based on best educational practices from throughout the Muslim world. And one of the things we did in that regard was to take the National Madrasa Oversight Board. These are the 5 religious leaders that sit on top of the sects that sponsor these schools. We took them down to Turkey and to Egypt to see how they handle Islamic education. And frankly, they went with a bit of an attitude, what can these secularists teach us religious purists? They came back very humbled because they saw that Egyptian and Turkish students could not only handle religious questions every bit as well as any Pakistani madrasa student, but they also could handle contemporary problems. They'd had the math, the science, social studies. And that caused the board to say from now on, we're going to require that all madrasa leaders be accredited and certified. And started the process. We now have 3 universities who are providing this kind of training to the madrasa leaders. Also, they came up with the idea of formulating a peace textbook that would be put into all the madrasas across Pakistan. That has been put together with the benefit of madrasa scholars, very gifted scholars at that. And a teacher training institute has been established in the headquarters madrasa for each of those 5 sects, which is now teaching the teachers how to teach this peace textbook. So that just gives you a little of the flavor. This is ongoing. It will take time to make a real difference, but we've got all sorts of anecdotal differences that have been made. I'm going to show you a very short video here in a second. The other thing I just wanted to mention, though, on the education front was that we had an opportunity back in 2011. Our State Department asked us to take a hard look at Saudi textbooks for discriminatory content and to examine the global impact of that content. The idea behind it was to hit the Saudis over the head with the more atrocious passages one could find in those textbooks. When we got into it, we sensed that there was, there was some real openness to reform, and we prevailed on the State Department when we finished this in 2012 to not make it public. And said, let us try to facilitate reform through quiet diplomacy, and we have been on that track for several years now. And just before I came here, we finished up a recent meeting in Riyadh where we bring together American and Saudi scholars, education scholars, and experts to the table as equals to deal with a problem that you share in common. That's the only way you can remove any sort of paternalism aspects. And certainly we've got enough problems in the United States in our education system to hold our own at a table like that. But this is, our hope is, and we have every reason to believe that this will succeed because we're very far along in the process now, that by the end of it, the more onerous Wahhabist content that one has found in those textbooks and teacher training materials will have been purged. And this is the very content that has given rise to or inspired the activities of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other groups like that. So these are, these are the kinds of things that take a while to show an impact and results, but the strategic implications are very, very high. And I think I would ask for your prayers to help us see this through. We'll show this video here just for a moment about Pakistan. Do we have time? It's only 4 minutes. Yeah. Okay. And then we'll summarize at the end, please.
लेकिन बदकिस्मती थी इस्लाम में इतनी इजाजत नहीं। Why should a child say yes? Why not no to militancy? अल्हम्दुलिल्लाह ये पहले ये था कि हम तो एक रूप पर देता था, एक रूप पर देख रहा था, उसके आगे पीछे उसका पर्दा, उसका बात तोलने का हमें नमूना मिलता था ना, हम ये गवारा करते थे कि उसकी बात उसका बात तोल। चेंज तब्दीली उस वक्त से आई कि मैंने पहला वर्षा आज़ाद साहब की क़यादत में, उसकी रहनुमाई में, उसकी लेक्चर में हमने वहाँ शमूलियत की। एक होता है क्रिटिसिज्म, तनकीद या फीडबैक, कभी-कभी जो फीडबैक देना, दूसरा होता है क्रिटिकल थिंकिंग। फिर उस चीज़ों को तोड़ कर सोचना। अल्लाह ने तो तनकीदी सोच बचपन में बच्चे के अंदर डाली होती है, वो हमारा एक बहुत अच्छा माशाल्लाह से करतूत है बड़ों का, जो कि हम उसको खत्म कर देते हैं। पता है कैसे? एक ज़माना ऐसा आता है कि बच्चे की एक ऐसी उम्र होती है जिसमें वो हर चीज़ में पूछता है ये क्यों नहीं, ये क्यों, ये लाइट इतनी ब्राइट क्यों होती है, ये ग्रास इतनी ग्रीन क्यों होती है। डिपेंड ये करता है कि तनकीदी सोच को भागना वहां से हो जाए।
This is our project
तो आपको बाप बनाया है, बल्कि बहुत ज्यादा लोग डेफिनेशन जो इल्म की करते हैं वो यही कहते हैं कि ability to ask questions। ये तो हम जो सोचते हैं कि अमेरिका की एजेंट के लिए काम कर रहे हैं, इसमें कितना अमेरिका की एजेंसी का किरदार इससे साबित हो रहा है। जिस पर सोचें ये तो दीन इस्लाम के लिए, मुसलमानों के लिए, मुसलमानों पर जो ब्लेम है, मुसलमानों पर जो दाग है, उनकी मिटाने के लिए। और ये तो मुसलमानों की ट्रेड में ये बात जा रही है। आप लोग ये करता है, जितने आप लोगों के ज़हन में है दहशतगर्दी के बारे में, इंतहा पसंदी के बारे में, सब इसके आप सब मुसलमान लोग कह रहे हैं। तो ये जब आपसे ये सुना तो मेरे ज़हन में थोड़ा पराधीन पैदा हुआ।
There are so many ways that how your youth has changed that surprise us as well, especially me.
मैंने अमेरिका में जब देखा फातिहा का, जब हमने विजिट किया, वहाँ पर जब मैंने देखा तो मैं, आप यकीन करें मेरे आंसू में आंसू आए, तो मेरे आंखों में आंसू आए। वहाँ अमेरिका में जो लोगों ने उनसे वो आप नहीं छीना कि आप फातिहा में क्या कर रहे हैं, तो मैं लुत्फ़अंदोज़ भी हुआ और एहसास भी हुआ कि काश जिससे हमारे मुल्क में एक इदारे हमारे मुसलमान है, वो बेस्ट मुसलमान है, अपने मुसलमानी पर कायम है, लेकिन कोई उसको तंग नहीं करता है। लेकिन यहाँ के हालात कुछ और है, काफी डिफरेंस है। यहाँ पर कॉलेज में जो लोग पढ़ते हैं ना, तो वो मदरसे के लोगों को अकाल की निगाह से देखते हैं, और यहाँ पर मदरसे में जो लोग पढ़ता है ना, तो उनके लिए जो कॉलेज के जो लोग हैं ना, उनकी निगाह में वो भी कुछ नहीं है।
He decided to build a whole school named after Al-Fateh Academy in Virginia and follow the similar model of that school.
One thing that's very interesting about the gentleman with the white beard, he allegedly gave sanctuary to bin Laden right after 9/11. When he came to a first workshop, he came with the intent of actually killing our project director, who you saw there, Azhar Hussein, Ozzy we call him. When he did not hear an American agenda, instead what he heard was about how to become better Muslims, he converted. He became a huge champion of ours. And among other things, at one point, he facilitated a meeting that I had in the mountains of Pakistan with 57 Taliban commanders to tell them what America wanted, because they claimed that they didn't know, and I wasn't sure we knew ourselves. But we had that meeting, and in the wake of it, it's a fascinating story, no time to tell it here. But in the wake of that meeting, 4 years later, we had him to the United States, and you saw some evidence there of what he saw in Virginia. We renewed ties, and he invited me to come see him again, and I thought I gladly accepted, but I recall that after that meeting in the mountains with the Taliban commanders, Al-Qaeda had come in and confiscated the construction equipment that he rented out as a way of making his living. So I asked Ozzy, I said, how could he invite me again, having paid such a terrible price the first time I visited? And I said, I don't know, I'll go ask. And he asked him, and here's what he said. He said, I would rather die than not offer hospitality to somebody I like. And that's very cultural there. And it's very humbling to me to see people who take hospitality to that level. It's heartwarming and something I think we could all consider emulating. Anyway, I've exceeded my time. For those of you who are interested, we have some brochures on the table here, and happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
I'm going to formally close out this session, but of course, please, if you've got questions, please do grasp the person that you want to ask the question of. But otherwise, I'm sure there are places for coffee, and we look forward to hearing your questions. Do we have time to stay in the room?
Let's have 10 minutes question.
Okay, so if you have time?
Yeah, I just want to add something very interesting about what Dr. Johnston said. I was living in America in the 90s, and I identify totally with that, what the white bearded man said in Pakistan, that the best Islam is in America. It's true, because it's an open and an environment of freedom and science, and religion is based, this Islam is based on ilm, on science. So we had scholars coming in Dar Hijra. I don't know if you know Dar Hijra in Virginia. And that's where I got my basics of Islam, the beauty of this religion in America. So I totally identify with this gentleman. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we have the gentleman in the back.
Thank you very much. My name is Sloman Reza, Academic Council on the United Information System. principles you are teaching in the madrasas. As you may know, one of the cardinal principles in the UN is the right to life. My question is the following. As we may recall, the right to life has been in the sentence 13th century in Europe and in the Western world made really a sacrosanct, and the Islam and Christianity simply went apart. According to Tamerlane, at least there is eternal life after death. So there is a little barrier to the real life. So my question is, which element of Islam you are referring when you teach the right to life in madrasas? Thank you.
I think one that we appeal to, it's this is kind of a consolidated paraphrase of three passages from the Quran, but it says, "O God, could have made us one had you willed, but you did not. Instead, you made us into separate nations and tribes, that we may know one another, cooperate with one another, and compete with one another in good works." When we engage with Muslims on this basis, for example, we say we're trying to open the competition in good works. And we appeal to the parts of the Quran, just as you find in any holy book, that hold life very reverent and hold it on high. And that's not to say that what we're up against. In some of these madrasas, you find suicide belts hanging outside. In very few, but it's having to turn that around. One of the other great difficulties in this process is that when you have a country like Pakistan, quite honestly, despite the democratic trappings, it's a feudal country at heart. Those on the top are not interested in empowering those on the bottom. In fact, they'd like to stay on the bottom because they see it as a zero-sum game. If they benefit, then they're going to lose. And so in all rankings of percent of GDP devoted to education, Pakistan always stands very near the bottom. And there is not only a willingness, but a desire to keep a lot of the population illiterate so they can't vote and upset the status quo. And that's a reality. Nobody talks about it much, but that's a reality. And when people can't read, it's very difficult to turn around arguments that the militants have used, because they can't see for themselves exactly what the Holy Quran says. So our efforts are imperfect at best, but we are making strides, and any number of these folks have now stood up and resisted others who were stepping out and moving down the avenue of terrorism.
So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
I had a question, Mr. Johnson, because you just mentioned the fact that the lack of education has some. Do you see? Well, I'll put it this way. Do you see the lack of education in the countries as a doorstep towards terrorism? Then, when people are uneducated, when there is no educational process, because some countries have 65% even of the men who don't go to school, not to talk about the men. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Well, one of the reasons that the madrasas have grown so dramatically is because the public education system in Pakistan is in very sad shape. You have very famous, they have what are called ghost schools, schools on the books. Teachers get paid, but nobody shows up and nothing happens. And by default, you see people buying into the madrasas. The madrasas have, I'd say 88% of the madrasa students approximately are from very poor families who would not be able to afford any education under any circumstance. So they're getting some education. They also get room and board, and they probably have none of that, many of them. So it's fertile ground for negative agendas unless people are soundly equipped with exactly what their holy scriptures say and what they're supposed to be about. At the end of the day, however, one of the hard realities, you have this demographic tidal wave in the whole region. I apologize. But not only South Asia, but the Middle East and North Africa, where the number of jobs will never be sufficient. And unless you can get at the end of winning those hearts and minds, unless you can get a job for someone, by default, many of them end up as insurgents because they get paid to be an insurgent. And this is one of the other pieces that we're wrestling with. But it's a very heavy tide that we're shoveling against, but I am encouraged that it's made headway.
Hello, my name is Ali. I'm from Fez, Morocco. First, thank you to the panel for the brilliant interventions. My question is to Mr. Johnson. Your work seems to focus on Madrasas and Islamic teaching in the region of the Middle East and North Africa. However, when looking at the more or less recent news, either the Paris or the Brussels attacks involves people who barely went through any madrasas, who have not had or received any Islamic teaching. Rather, they have been educated in Western schools. So how do you think your approach could be channeled through, in a European context where perhaps religious teaching is not that present? Thank you.
That's an excellent question, and I don't know that I have a great answer for that. I will say this, one of the things that we're trying to do, and you see it in the title of this presentation here, we've got a project underway right now where we're looking hard at 4 countries at the moment, Pakistan, Yemen, Morocco, and Tunisia, to examine the governmental and civil society counters to the incursion of jihadi Salafism, and to figure out what works and what doesn't work and why not, but also to engage the very conservative Muslims in the development and implementation of these counters. In this whole business with the Madrasas, these are all very conservative religious leaders, if you will. And every Madrasa leader, almost without exception, is double-hatted as an imam in the local mosque. And so, as they come to recognize new realities and new truths, they have a platform which reaches many, many people. The European context is, I think, a particularly difficult one, just because of the ingredients there. It's a bit different than the American context, where I think the Muslims have become integrated in our society in a very healthy and sound way, even some of those get lured to supporting ISIS. So there's no magic recipe for the whole business, but I do think engaging the UK led the way in this, trying to engage very conservative Muslims in countering this kind of terrorist tendencies. And I think we're making good progress, but politically it got turned off. There was a concern that supporting the nonviolent Salafis would ultimately be a burden on society because of what they represent. And I think that was very short-sighted.
My name is Ibn Sheikh from the Tunisian Permanent Mission. First of all, I would like to thank the Kingdom of Morocco, the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy, and UNODC for organizing this event. My question before Mr. Mohammed Slawi, Dr. Mohammed Slawi, who explained very well the difference between the real Islam and the religion extremism. My question is how we can hinder radicalism and the wrong interpretation of Islam we can violent extremism using Islam for terrorism and criminal purposes. Thank you.
Thank you, colleague, for this interesting question. Well, I'm starting, I'll tell you that I'm not a scholar in Islamic science to give you a clear answer. So I have my personal opinion. And what I said, this religion is based on ilm. So if you have access to education, and you have access to a curricula of the true teachings of Islam, you ipso facto become away from terrorism, because this religion does not accept violence in any ways, even in times of war. Among the instructions of Islam, you cannot even burn a tree in times of war. So how about the human life? And in the Quran, it is clearly indicated on one of the verses, if you kill one human being innocent, it's as if you killed the whole humanity. And if you save one life, it is as if you save the whole humanity. So to see how, where the value of human life is situated, is above everything. And it is also one of the hadiths of the Prophet saying that if you are in a situation of redemption as long as you have not killed a person, human being. So it's very important. And after killing a human being, it's very difficult to get pardoned or saved. So just to tell you, human life is very valuable. So I think the problem, personally, is a lack of access to education and to science and the true teachings of this religion. But I can give you many answers when we are together, but I think I will stop here. Thank you.
I'm going to take two last questions. Oh. And I had said to this gentleman by nods and to this gentleman here. So back here first, and then.
Thank you very much for being on the board. My name is Usama Desi. I'm from the region of Iraq. My question is, first of all, I'd like to thank the region of Morocco and the UNODC for organizing this event. I would like also to thank the panelists for their insightful, constructive comments. My question goes to Mr. Johnston. Actually, myself, I was a Fulbright scholar in the United States, and I was pretty happy to be in the DC area where I was at the school to find a field where I attended a class called The Role of Religion and Culture in Peace Conservation. But with my humble assessment, and I want to see your vision on that, I find it's too little within American institutions, or let's say in general in the Western Hemisphere, that this field is emerging. It was very necessary to bridge the gap between two different cultures and different religions among students when I saw it there, and it was very, very constructive to ease the negative thinking about the Middle East, North Africa, and the Islamic world in the shadow of the recent terrorist attacks. What's your evaluation and vision? I mean, do we need to Western academia or institutions need to do more on that sense? Because whenever we have an attack, the media also play a very negative role. Some of the media, I cannot say all the media, by putting more oil into the fire and creating the social uproar, as we hear several incidents, comes as revenge from a certain situation. Maybe when there is a foreign targets for certain terrorist attacks. I just need to know about your vision in this field, vice versa to the Western communities. Thank you very much.
That's a very good question, and it's one that I think should demand a lot of attention on our part. In our deliberations with the Saudis, we've been looking very hard at how Islam is portrayed in the West, particularly in the United States. We find that it's the coverage is minimal and spotty. It speaks of, you'll see a lot more material on what it was long ago. Any material that talks about it currently tends to identify with the terrorism and that sort of thing going on. But I personally think that we in the West need to do a much better job of teaching comparative religions so we understand how the world operates. For far too long, we've let secularism be an excuse for not doing our homework to understand how religion informs the worldviews and political aspirations of others. Until we can develop an empathetic understanding of other cultures, we're not going to be able to advance our interests in the world in an effective way. So I think you really hit on something that's important and that we need to pay a lot more attention to.
Thank you. My name is Kamil Arifi. I'm from the Development Commission of Morocco in Vienna. First of all, I would like to thank the whole three panelists for their presentation. Very quick question to UNODC and Dr. Johnson. For the UNODC, I mean, we have seen good experience on the issue of prevention of radicalization, prevention of violent extremism. One is the training of imams, and the other one is the madrasa. How could the UNODC benefit from those two experience and disseminate these good practices through tools, through other practical elements that you use in your work and disseminate it to other member states? Second question for Dr. Johnson, this is based on the question that put by my fellow Moroccan, the young guy who just left the room. On the Western context, many scholars try to explain the radicalization of Western-born Muslims, and they try to give many answers, but none of them should be can be accurate. And we see that your project with the Madrasa is a successful one, has been some result. And could we give the same approach to those kids who are born and they are driven by internet recruiting from ISIS or other terrorist group to try to prevent them from radicalization using the same experience that you have done in Pakistan? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I'm not sure I will be able to answer it to your satisfaction, but what we try to do in UNODC is to also to allow officials in one country to benefit from the experiences of other countries. So you were speaking about your work in Yemen. I've been working in Yemen quite a lot, and we organized a workshop on the incitement to terrorism and freedom of expression. And then we brought cases from Turkey, from France, from South Korea, even where courts have struggled with the question: where does legitimate exercise of freedom of expression end, and where does incitement of terrorism start? And then we look at how international bodies have assessed what the national courts have found. And we try to encourage people to think about how would you decide this? Do you agree with this approach or that approach? And I think that way we can learn from each other, and one country can learn from another country's experiences with regard to this very difficult questions of how to bring together full freedom to exercise and to manifest one's religion and one's religious thoughts, and the need to counter violent extremism or prevent violent extremism.
Yes, and as to your second question, it's a very good question. I think we're wrestling with that now to see exactly what might be done, but I don't think that what we're doing with the madrasas in Pakistan could really resonate as well in a social media or a virtual kind of context. Because a couple of observations. First, the only reason we're able to do what we do with the madrasas is because Islam is so decentralized. We could never pretend to do this in a Catholic boarding school, for example. They have hierarchy. But all we have to do is convince, persuade that local madrasa leader that we were offering a better mousetrap. He can buy it, sort of thing. So they buy into that. Also, another thing is reality in all this. We've got the UN represented here. We've got NGO. NGOs have an enviable freedom to do the right thing at the right time for the right reason, if they can find the funding. It's a big if much of the time. Nevertheless, it's that autonomy to do the right thing is terribly important, and we try to capitalize on that in every way that we can. A large part of our success in Pakistan has to do with personal chemistry as well. For example, I saw the pictures of our project director up there, named Azhar Hussain. He's a hero twice over. Not only does he bear the burden of being American, but he's also Shia. And where we operate, they do unmentionable things to Shia. But he grew up in Karachi, attended a madrasa, best trainer I've ever seen in my life, and he's one of the most likable people on the face of the planet. So we go in, and he makes friends so fast that by the time we figure out he's Shia, they don't want to hurt him. So we've been riding that horse for a long time. But it's how you approach people, and you have to, one of the things that's just fundamental to everything we do is coming out of a posture of respect. One of the things too that our approach is a very humble approach, because we're mindful that America was very complicit in planning the seeds of jihad in the madrasas in the first place, trying to grow holy warriors to evict the godless Soviets out of Afghanistan. So Soviets left and we left, and we come back, they're doing what we trained them to do, they just changed target. So with this peace textbook bill, I think we're finally putting some of the toothpaste back in the tube, and hopefully we'll. But your question about social media is a very good one, and we're wrestling with that right now. Don't have a good answer for you.
I just would like to touch upon what Mr. Gams has said regarding the sharing of good practices by UNODC. As far as Morocco is concerned, Morocco is willing, actually already sharing its experience with North and West African countries in order to help strengthen their national capacities in counter-terrorism. So apart from the religious aspect, Morocco is already involved in cooperation, both regional and bilateral, in fields that pertains to UNODC, pertaining to counter-terrorism, which include extremism, drug trafficking, money laundering, cyber crimes, illegal immigration, and weapons trafficking and proliferation. So I just wanted to complete your answer about that. Thank you.
Well, I did warn you that I was an unreasonable moderator, and here we are now, 80 minutes later, and it should have only been 50. I thank you so much for your time here, and again, I want to thank each of our presenters, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day and an excellent week. Thank you very much.